Progress. Welcome everybody to the Water and Environment Task Force. We have a really interesting topic today, and you know the merits of the parcel tax associated with this were debated, both pros and cons back in the day when it was being considered, and it did pass. And so it's neat to follow up now and see, okay, what's the fruit of all of this? And our speaker is well qualified and will address that topic. Just before we came on, we were talking a little bit about the rainfall. We always cover that as a part of this task force, and welcomed not the first storm so much that came in buckets, but a little more of a gentle pattern that's happened during October. And hopefully, unlike last year, it doesn't just dry up and quit. So we'll, as always, and when it comes to rain in California, you have to wait and see. You can't really, unfortunately, you can't really predict that. On the environmental side, my wife and I just got back from a motorhome trip to the Eastern Sierra, and we caught a little bit of the fall colors over there still. Two things that stand out for me that I think are worth showing, talking about to this task force on the environment. We passed through the Dixie, Caldor, and Tamarack fire zones, and I'll tell you, it's scorched earth. You know, it's awful, and so there's a lot of biomass out there that's just standing there in bad shape, and we have the Forest Service that doesn't have the funding to really address that, I think. And so a fire history of putting fires out over the last 150 years has come back to haunt us. And so we've probably wiped out the forest, at least a third to a half of the forest in the state of California won't be really ready to be harvested for 100 to 200 years. It's just it's a huge change. But on the flip side, part of our trip south of Bishop, we went up into the Bristlecone National Park, and for those of you who don't know, that's in California. And while I have a minor in forestry from UC Berkeley, and you think of tree rotations, and you think of trees that might be 80 years old, 100 years old, 200 years old. The oldest tree on the planet is in the state of California at 11,000 feet, and it is 5,000 years old. So it's really very awesome. If you get the chance, I highly recommend that you go and check that out while it's still there, and hopefully it doesn't burn out. So with that, Dan, you want to cover the upcoming meetings, please?
Yeah, so per our tradition, we will not have a meeting in December, so everybody gets a break from meetings. And then in January, we're inviting Chevron Corporation to talk about their energy transitions. So we got a special guest speaker on that confirmed, and that's January 18th, our first meeting next year. And then we're working on 2 or 3 other ideas. We haven't firmed up the dates into February and March, but we're looking at maybe a presentation on desalination in early 2022, state legislation on water and environmental matters, maybe getting a speaker from the state on that. And another idea in the hopper is lithium battery recycling, an interesting issue. No dates set on those, but we're exploring those. As always, if you have ideas to add to the hopper, let any of us know and we'll add them to the list. We got a great list going, but we're always looking for like the very hottest time critical topics to hit.
Thank you very much, Dan. Lindy, or anybody, actually, we'll start with Lindy, but if you have any announcements, this is the time to do that.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Dan. Thank you to our Water and Environment Leadership Team and Planning Team. The only announcement I wanted to make is just to remind everyone that this Thursday, November 18th, is the East Bay Leadership Council Philanthropy Awards. It's a great opportunity to come and hear about some really inspiring nonprofits and individuals in our community who really, especially over this last year, have made a really impactful difference and been really ingenuitive and had some really kind of creative ideas as well. So we hope that you'll join us. It's going to be really inspiring, and it's all digital, so you can do it from the comfort of your home, just like the Water and Environment Task Force. If anyone would like more information, I'm happy to share it, but otherwise I'll put the link in the chat. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Lindy. Any other announcements from anybody? Well, the one that we talked about a little bit as we were coming online here is the congratulations to Marguerite Patel and Contra Costa Water District in general in terms of, and the other Bay Area agencies who have joined together on a joint powers authority agreement now and moving forward with the expanded Los Vaqueros Reservoir project. Okay, so our speaker today, Jim Fiedler, is somebody I've known for a very long time. And he was a leader. He's always been a thought leader, but a leader at Santa Clara Valley Water District, now called Valley Water. And in his career has overseen a lot of water supply development for Santa Clara and other parts of the region, especially in the South Bay. He did it. I've always admired his career. The one thing I didn't admire was his commute from Danville down to down to Santa Clara every day in that traffic. I don't know, Jim, how the heck you did that, but you did, and you persevered, and now have retired and doing some traveling. And you've taken on this assignment that you're going to talk about this morning related to the Measure AA that we passed. And as I indicated earlier, it was something that we thought long and hard about. We had people that were not interested in raising any parcel tax associated with this kind of a program. I, for one, was an advocate of not the $12, but to double that and start doing, some bigger stuff. But anyhow, we settled on the 12. Maybe it'll go somewhere in the future. I see in the infrastructure bill, I think I see in there $25 million, I think, for the San Francisco Bay. And so money, I think, is filtering in, and that's a good thing. We look forward to your presentation. Jim is on the Oversight Council, Citizens Oversight Council. My wife, Cindy, was on that before she became city councilwoman, and that opened up a spot, and Jim took that. And thank you for Jim for doing that. And I see Doug Wallace on the call here too, and he is also on that Citizens Oversight Committee. So Jim, whatever you say, Doug can make sure that you're correct. And so, Jim.
All right, thank you, Gary. Glad to be here and glad that Doug's here. And Lindy, I'm going to have you show the slides because my other computer froze up on me. So do you want to show the slides that you have?
Sure, but you're going to have to talk for about 30 seconds so I can get them pulled up.
Okay, all right, then I'll give the disclaimer then. I am not affiliated with the authority, and they want to make sure that I don't speak for the authority. Doug is on the call as well. We're on the Citizen Oversight Committee. So our job is simply to review the work that is being performed by the authority and to make sure they're complying with the Measure AA fund requirements. So here's the presentation I have. Thank you for pulling that up. In anticipation, I was going to lose my my computer. I sent a deck over to Lindy and to Gary earlier this week, and I'll run through this hopefully as quickly as I can. You want to go to the next slide? All right, so what I'm going to talk about is certainly the authority, the Measure AA, the projects that are funded particularly in Contra Costa County, and then a very interesting effort underway through the authority, the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, a way to sort of fast track permitting. And then I'll cover the Independent Oversight Committee that I'm a member of. Next slide. So what is the Restoration Authority? Obviously, it kind of surprising it was created way back in 08. It's governed by a board made up of local elected officials. And in our county, John Joya is our representative for Contra Costa or the county. And there's also a community-based advisory committee that helps guide the authority. I'm not a member of the community-based advisory, but there's a group of interested parties that really help give information to the authority. And then it was placed on the ballot Measure AA in 2016. And that was going to be the funding source for this. Obviously, it passed, as Gary alluded to. And then as part of that Measure AA, the Independent Oversight Committee was established. Next slide. So Measure AA is a $12 per year parcel tax. If you own property, you've seen it on your tax bill. It passed with a great majority, 70% over, and it's going to help restore over $2 billion worth of infrastructure along the Bay, restoration efforts. The measure itself is not going to raise that, but it's certainly going to be linked with other sources of funding, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide. So what does the authority fund? Habitat projects. that restore, protect, and enhance the wetlands. Flood management projects, the big one was in the South Bay, and public access along recreational amenities. That's also included in one of the projects in Contra Costa. Next slide. So I'll pass through this. This is all background knowledge. We'll go to the next slide. People know what shorelines are. So no more than 5% of the funds allocated that are collected can be used for administration. So that's interesting. You figure over their 20-year life, it's going to be interesting to see how they adjust for inflation, but interest can be used to help support the staff support. And then the measure itself formed the Independent Oversight Committee. Next slide. So real briefly then, what does it fund, or what can it fund? Safe, clean water and pollution prevention projects. You can see what the list of activities there that support that effort. Next slide. And then fish, and this is really the key, fish, bird, and wildlife habitat. Certainly very important in our wetland restoration effort, particularly in light of climate change. Next slide. And then integrated flood protection. Again, part of the projects that we're going to talk about a little bit later in Contra Costa was one that really integrated flood protection along with wetland restoration. And that's an important effort, and certainly trying to build those levees along the waterfront there in a really environmentally friendly manner. Next slide. And then public access. Again, that's pretty vital along the bay, getting people out there to see and recreate along the shoreline. And that's certainly an effort that the measure can also assist with. Next slide. So how do they go about setting the funding for the Measure A funds? Again, the funds are not approved by the Oversight Committee, but approved by staff itself. And this is a criteria they use in their recommendations to their board before they approve projects. Certainly a positive impact, long-term impact, obviously integrating with the other plans for restoring the bay, certainly leveraging dollars. We've seen that in Contra Costa and elsewhere, and monitoring maintenance and stewardship in those areas. Next slide. So the grant round, the fifth round of grants, which just finished in October, you can see the period of time, several months were allowed for interested parties to submit a proposal. And the plan is to fund up to $12 million worth of projects for this year. And that will be awarded later in the spring of next year. What will happen now is staff will review the proposals submitted and then present it to the board of the authority board later in the year. And then they'll be approving that. Next slide. Interestingly enough, they also have incorporated community grants programs. And this is a process where it really has an open rolling basis for applicants to submit proposals. Next slide. And then what these grants are used for is really to help support community-based organizations, particularly in the economically disadvantaged areas of communities, through training and through helping to really help people understand and become more aware of what is involved with helping restore the bay. Also, interestingly enough, the authority commissioned a study among the disadvantaged communities to understand better what motivates them in terms of understanding the potential that they have to really help improve their own local areas. And one of the findings of those studies, surprisingly, was that these disadvantaged communities have an inherent distrust of government. And so one of the points that the authority has been trying to do is really reach out to the communities to help them, reassure them this is a vital program for them to participate and engage in. Next slide. So here's some of the efforts of the graphic distribution of funds. I think one of the concerns of everyone was how were funds going to be distributed among the various projects that had been being proposed. So what you can see down here is sort of the list of the percentages of how the geographic distribution of funds have occurred to date. So you see the distribution. Let's go to the next slide. And then the projects funded to date, there's been 28 projects that the authority board has approved. That includes one community grant project. And you can see the distribution of those projects throughout the Bay Area. And there's been a couple of regional projects, including Spartina project removal and the Brit, which I'll speak about just a little bit later. and how much funds have been authorized to date, over $117 million worth of funds. Next slide. So this is the complicated chart that tries to illustrate how many projects have been funded, both in the construction phase or the planning phase over the various rounds of this is a cumulative chart. So you see much of the funding appropriately has been for construction. And there's been some planning grants, including one in Contra Costa County. Next slide. And then this is just the round 4 recommended programs that were approved last summer. And you can kind of see the distribution of that round of grants. And East Bay got a sizable portion of those funds that were allocated. Next slide. And then here's a complicated chart that the authorities provided. They expected the percentage of the 20-year targets, and then after the 4 years out of the 20 years. And then here's what the actual allocations have been. So here you see, let's focus on East Bay, second column. You see over $90 million are expected over the 20 years. And we're at about almost like 20 million of our allocation of what was thought about as projects that we're going to be supporting efforts in the East Bay. Next slide. And then very importantly, here's the progress to, and this is kind of a hard chart to see, but you can see the various percentages of the elements really are the backbone of Measure A. So restoring 15,000 acres of wetlands are about 32% along the way. Maintaining, enhancing, what's that, 1,500 acres of managed ponds. And you see down the various lists, restoring 500 acres of shellfish habitat and so forth. So these are sort of the targets that have been set in the program. And this is where the authority is to date on achieving those desired outcomes. Next slide. Now here's 3 of the projects that have been specific to Contra Costa County: North Richmond, Shoreline Living Levee, Terminal 4 Wharf Removal Project, and the Lower Walnut Creek Restoration Project, also known as the Pacheco Marsh area. Let's go to the next slide. So the first one is the North Richmond Shoreline Levee, Living Levee Project, 645,000 allocated toward this. This particular project is a planning and design effort. It doesn't include construction at this point, but you can kind of see on the slide here, it's really one of these worthwhile projects, really helping to restore and provide flood protection, as well as access for the public, and also transitional habitat in this particular part of Contra Costa County. Next slide. Second project is a Terminal 4 Wharf Removal Project. It was 2.3 million allocated. This included construction. And this is one for removing what you see in front of on the slide there, demolishing the derelict piers and pilings, and helping to restore this portion of the bay. So this is a project I think is completed. Next slide. And then finally, this project, which is an interesting project. This is the Lower Walnut Creek Restoration Project. This was one that was a combination of flood control and wetlands restoration. On the left is an actual photo. On the right is a artist rendering of what it would look like when we're done. And as I think most of you are aware, they recently breached one of the levee phases, or one of the levees in this particular project that was done a couple of weeks back. It made some good news. And this is a project that is leveraging that 7.9 million from the authority with the 11 or so million that was raised by the county, and also through other sources of funding. And it really is typical of the type of effort that I believe the authority is really striving for, really these projects that are multi-funded, and the benefits of the restoration effort really help couple with those other funding sources that are available. So this is an exciting project. Some of you may have been out on the dedication ceremony, I think it was last week or so. Next slide. So then I mentioned there was 2 Bay Area-wide projects that are also benefiting Contra Costa. The Brit, it's called, and this is an effort to improve permitting. And then the invasive spartina removal project, I think it's a $4 million effort throughout the region to help remove the invasive species. Next slide. So this is an interesting issue. As any of you have been involved with working with regulatory agencies, know the challenges of getting permits. And you would think about restoration projects would be projects that would be almost like on the rapid permitting phase, but nonetheless, these projects do take time to get permits. Next slide. So what was created was the BRIT, the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. You see on the slide there, Sam Shuckett, who recently retired as the executive director. And you see some of the agencies that are also involved with helping to streamline permitting, particularly for these restoration projects. Next slide. And the initial funding for this was through a number of agencies. You see their names listed on there. Some of the funding also is coming through the Restoration Authority. Next slide. And then here is the team of regulatory agencies and the individuals that have been involved with BRIT, really helping to get together and presumably streamline these permits that are necessary for these important projects. Next slide. So according to BRIT, this is what they've done so far. There's been, as you see on the screen, 18 priority projects. They permitted 4, and they're close to permitting 1. This is, I think, a couple months old. And they provide guidance. Many tools are on the web page for those applicants that are seeking these projects. Next slide. And we can go to the next slide. They've learned enough. Let's go to the next slide. So here, well, go back one. This one here, how do you get on the Brit list? Now, the important point of this is you don't necessarily have to be receiving funding from the authority to be on the project list. So if you have an interesting project, a restoration project in the Bay, you also could be eligible to be on the so-called fast track list for BRIT. So certainly you can sign up. You see on the screen here, the methods for doing so. You must qualify for funding. So in other words, you must be a project that had qualified for funding. Whether or not you received it is another matter.
Lunch with Candy and here, the CEO.
Okay.
So we know what's coming. But
I think somebody might, oh, good. All right, thank you. Okay. And again, also importantly, a project that would have been eligible had there been funding available. So again, if any of you are working on projects that are any restoration project, I would encourage you to get your project on a BRIT list and be eligible for some fast track permitting. Next slide. So now let's move to the Oversight Committee. So the role of this committee is threefold. One is to review the authority's conformance with Measure A or AA, review their audits and expenditures and financial reports, and then also publish an annual report, which the Oversight Committee has done. This is my first year on. I think this is Doug's first year as well. And so there's been some reports. We completed our report earlier this year. Next slide. So who is on this Oversight Committee? Paul Jones and Terry Young are the chair and vice chair. Don Arnold representing the South Bay, Nancy Cave, West Bay, myself on East Bay, and then Doug, who lives in Marin, was covering North Bay. Next slide. So part of our work involves reviewing the authority documents. This is one of their annual reports, their latest one. It's available on their webpage, and this is one of our documents that we review. But it really kind of provides a nice synopsis of the undertakings for the year and the cumulative impact of the work of the authority and these projects that are funded through the authority funding. Next slide. So some of our findings for this year I'll review and some of our recommendations. So our first findings were reviewing the financial audit. And again, with another clean audit for the authority. And from what we saw, the authority staff continues to operate efficiently and effectively within the auspices of their funding. Next slide. And then another recommendation on project selection and finding, we find that there's solid project selection process and an implementation process. We thought there was advances in the permitting through the BRIT, as I mentioned earlier. And the Oversight Committee felt that we support the BRIT and recommended continuation and expansion. Next slide. So in terms of staff support, from our findings from our work, we thought that staff have been open and receptive to our inquiries and recommendations. The committee meets several times a year, and we receive presentations from staff and get a little bit more insight into what's happening with the authority. And we've been very pleased with the staff interaction with us and the work that they've undertaken. The The authority is engaging with communities of color. I mentioned earlier the report and survey they had done among disadvantaged communities, which is very insightful. And that again is on their webpage if you're interested in that information. And we also recommended some improvements to show project funding cycles in their webpage. Next slide. So recommendations looking forward. One of the areas was reevaluating the Bay-wide information regarding restoration goals. I think one of the concerns we have is when you look at individual projects, how do those projects together really help improve the overall restoration throughout the Bay? So reevaluating that information as we undertake these projects is very important to us. In documenting the value of the sum of the restoration work. So these individual elements are great, but then how does that work towards the larger goal? As we know that when you have habitat that's combined together with other projects, you get the biggest bang for the buck as far as restoration value. And then using the Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program is a vital tool for undertaking these efforts. And all of those activities I mentioned above will help, all those recommendations will help improve project selection process moving forward. Next slide. And other recommendation from our Oversight Committee is on communications. And again, ramping up communication to the public, certainly for the environmental and for communities. And then using Eco Atlas and the Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program are good tools for helping understand the value added of these restoration projects. And that would help incorporate future restoration needs in our program as we think about climate change and sea level rise, and then improve the clarity and detail of the reporting that they do to the public and to their board. Next slide. So for information about the SF Bay Restoration Authority, they have the great website. So just you see the hyperlink on the screen there. Again, it gives good information about the governing board, the advisory committees, the oversight. As would you expect from a public agency, they have great information about their agendas, their meeting minutes, their attachments, their other resources, their publications, their financial statements. All of that is really clear and easy to navigate on their webpage. And they also have a current projects page that lists each of their projects in detail and provide the actual authorization of their board, their staff recommendations. It's actually a very nice synopsis of each project and the summaries and other information for media that have also been raised by projects. Next slide. And that concludes my very fast-paced and abbreviated presentation. Again, Doug and I are members of the Oversight Committee and not members of the Authority Board. We're happy to take any questions that you may have regarding what we think of the authority and the work they're doing and the important work of the restoration efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So before we start the questions and answers, which Lindy's going to run, I thought we'd take a second and put Doug on the spot. And since Doug, this is your first year too on the Citizens Oversight Committee, I'd like to get your impressions and your thoughts as well. And then also John Coleman is Chief Executive Officer of the Bay Planning Commission, and this directly impacts a lot of the work that he's doing. So I'm wanting to know if he'd like to say a few things also. So I'll put you both on the spot. Doug?
Thanks, Gary. And my first comment is that I think Jim gave as good a presentation as any staff member would have. So I appreciate working with him. It's a pleasure. We have a set of veterans on the Oversight Committee, and it's been gratifying, a good spread of expertise and experience. The one thing I would add, and this is probably the obsession I bring to this position, is forecasting. I'm always thinking about how much more sea level rise we have to cope with in the coming decades. And I think I'm happy to see that the presentation outlines some of the sort of more forward looking imperatives that we have. Looking, for example, there's 100,000 acres of planned restoration in the Baylands goal. But that's a shifting margin there. And so what's going to happen to these wetlands that we've restored I can see that there's already good planning and anticipating future sea level rise and the need for areas for wetlands to migrate and that kind of thing. We've touched on, so that feels very, very important to me, both for future funding to ramp up what Measure AA has provided a wonderful down payment for, but future funding needs are going to be very substantial. I would say radical adaptation, combination of gray infrastructure, managed retreat, and very, very creative adaptation measures with wetlands and other means. And then the Brit, expanding the Brit. I'm glad that was, that's again, a kind of a down payment on future needs. I noted that all the members of the Brit are women. Maybe that's a sign that women are on average better collaborators. I'd like to see some mix in there at some point, and a bigger Brit. So thanks for this opportunity to pile on here, and that's pretty much what I have to say.
Excellent. Thanks, Doug. John, any comments?
Thanks, Gary. Jim, great presentation. This is really, as others have said, a down payment, but it's a small amount of money that's needed. Some estimates are upwards of $1 billion to basically reinforce the shoreline against climate change and sea level rise. It's gonna, and as the sea level rise increases, we're gonna have to figure out what we've made into shoreline restoration, how we protect that. And we can do that with some of the sediment, which would then help break down the wave energy as it comes smashing in to our assets. But this is critical. Is it enough money? No, but is it a good start? Yes. And we need to build upon it.
Great. Thank you. Again, I think your questions, if you want to do chat or raise your hand, that would be great. And Lindy will run that. But I'm going to take the liberty of putting one more guest on the spot, and that's Bob Whitley. Bob, you led the discussion on Measure AA, and you're always a guy that show me the progress. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are today, and in terms of your efforts to get this measure passed.
Thanks, Gary. Very informative presentation by the three honchos. We were concerned about how the program would unravel and the efficiencies and particularly the distribution of projects. Very pleased to see the emphasis on Contra Costa County, particularly as taxpayers who are not adjacent to the bay, but are paying the bill. That was a big topic of conversation at the time. And I do recall, thanks to Jim Kelly, a friend of mine, let's go to Richmond and have lunch and walk along the shoreline to see what we're talking about. That was a very convincing visit for me. And at the time, I was still uncertain about how the program was going to be administered. But in the end, said before our board, sometimes we just have to act on hope that it'll come out well. Today's presentation, I think, verified that that hope was well earned. So, yeah, I think it's good.
Good. Thanks, Bob. I'll turn it over to Lindy then for questions and answers.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Bob. And I'll be open about the fact that I have a bit of a cold, so if my voice sounds a little funny, that's what's going on there. But if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Or if you'd like to put it in the chat, if you're either not able to or don't want to actually chime in with your voice, I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. You can just use the chat function, which should be available at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And it looks like John has a question. So John, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I was surprised, Jim, by how much money the East Bay has gotten, because I know when this was being discussed, and I remember John Joy at the meetings at the Conservancy was very critical how not enough money was going to the East Bay. And I'm surprised by how much initially has gone to the East Bay. I'm happy. I mean, it needs to be spread around the Bay Area, but I'm happy. How did this happen? Because initially, most of the projects being identified were in the South Bay, in the North Bay, and the East Bay was sort of being left out.
I think, I don't know all the answers to that, John, but I think part of it was due to the fact of, as Doug alluded to, that goals project, it really identified potential areas. And I think probably outreach to some of the wastewater plants and some of the other projects that are along the East Bay shore that really help galvanize. Certainly you have this money. And I think too, credit the authority staff for really reaching out to those areas to really encourage potential applicants to apply. There's a great resource there. And I'm happy to see it too, that the East Bay is getting necessary projects funded.
Thanks, John. I agree. I was excited to see that, and I agree. Also, a little surprised. It's a good question. Does anyone else have a question?
So this is Gary. I can't find that little hand thing.
No worries.
Screen it all. I apologize. And I was putting this in the chat, but so Jim and Doug, is there funding in the infrastructure bill that was signed yesterday for this program?
My understanding, as John alluded to, yes, I believe there is some money for that, not funding through the authority necessarily, but I think for projects that really could help support wetlands restoration along the bay, consistent with ecosystem goals, and so forth. So I believe there is funding. And certainly when you link that with some other flood control money too, that might be beneficial to have a win-win there as well.
In the next few days, I have a couple days, I plan to actually dig into that bill. And the number I remember is 500 or 550 bill. No, I'm sorry. I can't remember the specific number for climate change related actions, but this money will certainly flow through existing federal agencies and programs. And I will look into that for several reasons and get back to you, Gary. Are you the best point of contact to share
sure.
this information? Because it's a big pulse of money. I think you're all aware. I think I have my numbers right now. There's 3.7 billion of state money over 5 years. And I'm happy to see that the initial emphasis there in year one is on disadvantaged communities and getting funding to them. Something I'm also pleased to see with the Bay Restoration Authority is a strong emphasis on these communities that have been neglected and have their reasons for distrusting government historically. So that's a pair of important programs. Again, I will try to nail down some specific dollar amounts, both federal and state, that we can look forward to receiving in the coming years and share that with you.
Doug, if I can jump in real quick, sorry. On December 13th, actually, the Bay Planning Coalition, and anybody's welcome to attend. At our infrastructure, we're having a briefing on the infrastructure legislation. And Amy Hetzel from the Coastal Conservancy and Stu Townsley from the Corps of Engineers, and Eric Saperstein from DC, and probably Roger Cockville from DC, and somebody from ABAG and MTC will be part of a panel talking about that money, how it's going to come into the Bay Area, where it's going to be distributed and for projects that we're talking about here. So if anybody's interested, ping me and I'll make sure that you can join the dialogue on December 13th. It's at 9 a.m.
Great question. Thank you, John. Thank you, Gary. It looks like Carol has a question. Carol, do you want to go ahead and ask it, or do you want me to ask for you?
I'm happy to jump on. So I was just curious. I know that there's been a restriction in the funding to be just at the margins of the Bay. However, we've looked at projects in conjunction with funding from the EPA to try and see if we could help with what was termed sedimatch, right? A way to match sediment from certain areas with projects going on in the Bay, and looking for ways where we can move that sediment from the interior, because we've had all these flood protection projects that have been built over the years that, we need to hold water back. Well, that holds sediment back as well. So how do we get that sediment down to the Bay to where it's needed? And I was just wondering if there's been any discussion about looking at more interior projects that are ultimately benefiting the ring of the Bay, if you will. But I know that it was restricted in the beginning, and that was completely forbidden.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I don't know of that. I think it's a great idea to look at how do you move sediment down necessarily downstream. So that, you're right. I think it's mainly focused on shoreline, up to the transition zones and not including further upstream. But that's something you might want to take up with the authority staff to see how that could be incorporated into a proposal and receive funding.
If I could just chime in here as well, this dredge sediment is not the only good source of sediment. There are also trench soils. For any utility that does trench work, a lot of material gets taken out there, and it is material that's potentially for use. And then a little bit further out is biosolids, which may not be suitable for surface cover, but to provide bulk for ecotone slopes and so forth. So all of these are future sources of sediment, and I think we all know the bay is deficient in sediment input.
Yeah, so along that, in terms of funding, Doug and Jim and John, while you guys were talking, Eric Saperstein put out a summary of the infrastructure bill. And so I just put that link on there for everybody. And it really is a nice summary of the entire program. But under regional programs, there is listed San Francisco Bay at 24 million, whether that's specific to this program or not, I don't know, but it looks like about $5 million a year over the next several years.
Thank you for sharing that, Gary. It's great to look at. I put a little blurb too, just kind of what exactly that funding category amount is, which is that 3.5 million. Sorry, 3.5 billion. I don't know why it says million. Dave, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Jim, and maybe Doug, one of the projects you showed was the removal of the wharf and kind of mentioned doing reinforcing the levee, part that. To avoid digging into all the projects, what just in a general way, what has you seen in the range of the character of the projects? And what in the project development have you seen that you think is unique that you probably hadn't thought about when you were thinking about this originally? What creative ideas has anybody come up with in some of these projects?
Oh, I haven't dug that much into these, Dave, but I think, for example, the largest funded project is the one in the South Bay. It's, I think, Coyote Creek flood protection for Valley Water. And that was a project long-term in the making. I think what you saw initially in some of these proposals were projects that, like even the Pacheco Creek or Walnut Creek, that was a project a long-term in the making. So in other words, you had these projects that were in the hopper, but they had not received enough funding for a variety of reasons. And so they were sort of languishing, that were then really accelerated through the authority funding. So I think initially it's some of these projects, and again, some of these, like the wharf removal, something that was probably an eyesore for years and people really wanted it, but couldn't really muster up the funds. And I think on Pacheco Creek and Walnut Creek, it's really the impetus of the additional funding from the authority that really helped galvanize. So I would say initially it's been more those projects that were long-term coming. And, but as far as the more recent ones, I can't really put my finger on one. I think one of the other notable long-term projects was the Montezuma restoration project that Jim Levee had championed for 20 years. And we had a chance to tour that earlier in the year to see just the progress it's made. And again, that was a fabulous project that was, also benefiting by some of the funding from restoration. So I don't know, Doug, maybe you can think of some of the ones that you recall.
Nothing to add at the moment.
Thank you. Dave, it looks like your hand is raised. Do you want to go next? One sec, I'm going to ask Dave to unmute. See if that might be part of
Okay. What was the question?
it. You have your hand raised. I just wasn't sure if you still wanted to ask a question.
Oh,
He didn't
no, that
know
was
he
just
did
what
Mm-hmm.
my question was.
Okay, no, just making sure. Sometimes people have to. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. I don't have anything in the chat. But last call, is there anyone else who kind of wanted to ask some questions of Jim and Doug, thank you both for being here. It's nice to have both of you as a resource.
I either suggested to everybody, if you have the chance, go to their webpage. And also, if you see some projects in your area, go out there and take a look at it. Boots on the ground is always great. But to see these projects, certainly go out there and see Walnut Creek, go see where the Wharf had been, the project there, and so forth, and see these projects, because I think you get a better sense. You know, it's so ironic that we spend so much time and effort appropriately on helping to restore the bay, and yet public access to the bay and really getting out there and seeing the bay is so limited, bay wide. So get out there and see these projects. It, to me, is a great way to really kind of experience what we're trying to be accomplished.
Agreed, Jim. I do have to say, Kristen went to the levee break with the John Muir Land Trust and was really taken back by it. She thought it was really incredible to see and really enjoyed being out there. So she sent us a bunch of pictures, which was fun to see too. Bob, you have your hand raised. Did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, so thank you for the presentation by the Oversight Committee today. I think it's the first one that I've actually participated in since the passage of AA. So my question is to Jim and Doug, what's your advice or recommendations of how we could get more frequent reports on upcoming projects and progress rather than spread out once every 5 years or so?
Well, you know, Bob, as I mentioned earlier, they're limited in terms of their budget for the authority staff. So that's predicated on that. But I think one thing to do is perhaps the Leadership Council task force here could look at the list of projects that are out there and perhaps invite one or more of the project proponents to a future discussion to kind of talk about the specifics of their projects, like the Pacheco and Walnut Creek project is a great one to kind of learn more about, or even arrange field trips as we get out of the COVID hibernation to really get out there and see these things through one of the project proponents. It's a great way to sort of see this stuff firsthand.
It seems like that worked for Bob, going out there and seeing it firsthand.
Well, by way of a closing comment, Bob, am I interrupting you? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just a brief war story. Just last week, our county board of supervisors in Marin approved an interesting project combining housing and an extended stay hotel right near the Manzanita Park and Ride. And that location's well known, I think. It's frequently reported on as being regularly flooded, sometimes during dry summer days. And this is a project that was being driven, I think, in part by the state's imperatives around creating more housing, of course. And then you have these two sometimes conflicting goals. Unfortunately, in the view of all the public commenters at that Board of Supervisors meeting who opposed the public members speaking, opposed that project on the basis of routine flooding. But the Board of Supervisors went ahead unanimously and approved the project. And my personal feeling was this was putting another permanent structure in harm's way. So it was just a very clear example close to home as these sort of pressures that are cooking up all around the shoreline. And so we're just going to see more of this, I think, this tension, because these are enormous issues: sea level rise adaptation, providing adequate housing, and then public safety as well, as far as evacuation routes and everything else.
Okay, thanks, Doug. I appreciate that closing comment. And Bob and Dave, you both have your hand raised, but I assume that's from previous questions. Okay, I noticed that Audrey is here. Audrey is one of our task force leaders, so I just wanted to mention her since we talked a little bit about Gary and Dan early in this meeting, but it takes a whole planning team to make these happen. So as was mentioned, if you have suggestions or ideas, please send them forward. We're always excited to hear from all the members of our task force, and we get the pleasure of getting together quarterly to kind of really think out when these meetings should happen and who our primary speakers should be. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of the Bay Leadership Council to all those who volunteer to make this happen. It really means a lot. That's the end of what I have to say. Gary, did you want to conclude us at all, or have anything else you wanted to add?
Well, okay, one small thing. When you take a trip to the East Sierra in a motorhome for a week and a half, it's just amazing to me how much weight you can gain living in your kitchen versus how long it takes to get rid of the damn stuff. But besides that, enjoy yourselves. December is our month off, and happy holidays, and be safe. And yeah, looking forward to a great 2022.
Absolutely. See you all in 2022. Thank you so
right.
much.
Thanks,
Thank
Phil.
you,
Yeah.
Jim and Doug.